This is a footnote. From Calvin's correspondence of the time, we sense a feeling of insecurity arising over the reception given to the news of the Servetus liquidation. In a letter dated 5th of October, 1554, he cried on the shoulder of a friend, "If you knew but the 10th part of how I have been hurt by these shameful calumnies, you would, kind as you are, groan beneath the burden of grief by which I am being tried. Dogs bark at me from every side. Whatever of slander they can invent is being hurled at me. Actually, the unfriendly ones and the critical in our own camp attack me even more fiercely than the acknowledged foes in the papal community. Surely I have not deserved this at the hands of the Church." It seems that the dissatisfaction even in Geneva itself was great enough to occasion the postponement of the celebration of the Lord's Supper. It was postponed at least once, and perhaps as much as 3 times in that season. Although Calvin and Beza complained bitterly about the tone of the anonymous criticism of what had happened, anyone who reads it will have to agree that although it does not mince matters, it is written with a poise that was quite unusual in those times, and keeps itself from railing and invective in a surprising way. One must agree with a recent Dutch scholar as he says that it is likely that future generations, as they judge of the matter, will ascribe the violent tone of Calvin and Beza's reply to it to a conscious or unconscious sense of weakness, rather than a well-grounded conviction that their position was right. In the reply to the anonymous critic of the burning of Servetus was the burning of Servetus was defended to the hilt, as well as the whole sacralist line of thought that had spawned the awful deed. Naturally, there were proof texts, and again, naturally, they were derived primarily from the Old Testament. As the Genevan sacralists, Beza seems to have been the principal author, searched the New Testament for support, they, and again very naturally, were unable to come up with much. One is certainly not impressed with Beza's proof text drawn from the book of Acts, quote, "With what power, pray, did Peter put to death Ananias and Sapphira? And with what power did Paul smite Elymas blind? Was it with the power that is vested in the church? Of course not. Well, then it must have been with the power that is vested in the magistrate, there being no kind of third power." One gets the impression that this is a matter of a drowning man clutching at straws. This is atrocious hermeneutics, and is far from responsible interpretation of Scripture. We shall not dignify this specious argument with more than the reminder that the part which Peter played in the matter of Ananias and Sapphira finds no parallel at all in the part which the Genevans had played in the death of Servetus. Moreover, it is news indeed that, quote, "Paul blinded Elymas," and that this episode had been paralleled in the Servetus burning. Footnote. Calvin tried hard to keep up his spirits in the matter, writing to his friend Sulzer at Basel that "this book filled with slander against me has been patched together in order that a sudden opposition to me might occur. The Senate has decided to put it in my hands for study. It was not hard for me to cut short its slander. I was even able to turn it to my own profit." Okay. The plain fact is that Beza cum sui reeled before the onslaughts of Bellius. What is there to say to a passage like the following? Who would not mistake the Christ for a Moloch or some such god, if indeed he delights in human sacrifice? Imagine him to be present in the capacity of constable, to announce the sentence and light the fire. O Christ, thou Creator and King of all the earth, dost thou not see these things? Art thou so changed completely, become thus cruel and contrary to thine own proper self? Dost thou command that those who do not understand thy commandments and institutions as yet are to be choked in water, struck until the bowels gush forth? These then strewn with salt, to be struck with the sword, or made to roast over small fire, with every torment martyred in as drawn out a manner as possible? Ah, Christ, dost thou indeed command such things, and dost thou approve of them when they are done? Are they indeed thy lieutenants, who officiate at such burned sacrifice? Dost thou allow thyself to be seen at the scene of such butchery? Dost thou then verily eat human flesh, O Christ? If thou doest such things forsooth, or orderest them done, then what, pray what, hast thou left for the devil to do? What did Beza have to say to this sharp but not uninspired voice? Nothing more than this. Quote, "Of all the blasphemous and impudent gabs." The text from which we quote, a Dutch translation of which we shall speak presently, made by a man whose knowledge of the Latin was superb, whose translation can therefore be trusted, has, and then there's something in Germanish. This rejoinder, needless to say, is not in the idiom of good theological discussion. It is a classic of ad hominem, and bespeaks only weakness and frustration. The footnote says, in the sentences whereby heretics were sent to the stake, it was usually specified that the execution was to be by, quote, small fire. It seems that in the case of Servetus, green wood was used, so that it took 3 hours before he was pronounced dead. The tract which we are discussing gains in significance for our present purpose when it is known that early in the 17th century a spiritual son and heir of Genevan sacralism, one Johann Bogerman, assisted by a ministerial colleague, the man who was destined 2 decades later to chair the great Synod of Dort, republished it in the Dutch translation, to which we have already referred, at Franeker and on the presses of Gillis Vandenrod, printer for the Staten General. Evidently Bogerman thought that Beza's book was still good reading, good enough to be reprinted and recirculated. That already speaks volumes, for it indicates that the sacralism that had precipitated the burning of Servetus, as well as the literature that came forth in support thereof, was still regnant in Dutch Reformed circles. Another footnote says, the Public University of Amsterdam has a copy of this Dutch translation, which we were permitted to have and to use in the United States through the facilities of the University of Michigan's Interlibrary Loan Service. It is from this volume that we quote. The plot thickens when it is known what it was that made Bogerman put Beza in a new suit. From the lengthy introduction prefixed to the translation, we learn that this was the occasion. Bogerman and his ministerial associates at Groningen were just then starting a crusade against a group of Anabaptists who were holding worship services in the quiet of their own houses. The translation was made to get the magistrates to, quote, do your duty to the God who has put the sword into your hands. Strike down valiantly these monsters in the guise of men. From the lengthy introduction, we learn that some years earlier, while Bogerman was stationed at Sneek, he had been instrumental in getting the magistrates to do their, quote, duty by driving apart a similar nest of heretics. On that occasion he had come, uninvited and arm in arm with the constable, into the meeting, had likewise uninvited, offered a lengthy prayer for the benefit of these heretics, and had once more, without being asked, given them the benefit of a long sermon, in which all their errors were neatly dissected. The most pathetic thing in the whole sorry account is that Bogerman wrote all this in the full confidence that his readers would applaud him for these feats of faithfulness. So sacralist was his thinking. Beza had written, and Bogerman revived it, that the freedom of conscience for which the critics of the Servetus affair were clamoring was, quote, worse than the tyranny of the Pope, as much worse as anarchy is worse than tyranny. The medieval doctrine of the 2 swords was roundly endorsed by Beza and Bogerman. We read that, just as the members of the body have, in spite of their several functions, one single assignment in one body, so also in regard to the Church, to the support of which both the civil power and the ecclesiastical have been divinely commissioned. Let this then be the conclusion of this argument. Those who would bar the Christian magistracy from the care of religion, and especially from the punishment of heretics, condemn the plain word of God, reject the authority of the ages, a not very Protestant argument, be it noted, coming too close for comfort to the Catholic idea of, quote, tradition, and as a consequence seek the total destruction and extermination of the Church. There is a great temptation, but no need, to dwell longer on the Servetus matter and the literature produced in support of it. Enough has been said to make it quite apparent that the final strains of the Reformation were played in the register of Christian sacralism. If more is needed, we have only to point to the fact that the Belgic Confession lays upon the magistrate the duties which had led to the burning. It was not until the acids of time had bitten deep into the sacralist pattern that Article 36 began to embarrass Reformed people, and that did not take place until comparatively recent times. It did not take place in the Netherlands until the establishment status of the Hervormd Kirk had been made fictitious by the secessions. Calvin's essentially sacral conception becomes apparent further in his reaction to the Anabaptist Manifesto, promulgated at Schlatten-on-Rond in the year 1527. We pause for a brief examination of it and of Calvin's response to it. One of the points made in the Schlatter-am-Rond statement has to do with the sword function in connection with the Church. It reads as follows: "The sword is an ordinance of God outside the perfection of Christ. The princes and rulers of the world are ordained for the punishment of evildoers and for putting them to death. But within the perfection of Christ, excommunication is the ultimate in the way of punishment, physical death being not included." We would submit that for any man who no longer thinks in terms of Christian sacralism, this formulation is right and proper. The sword is said to be a divine institution, with power to coerce, if need be, to inflict the death penalty. But this sword, so it is said, has no coercive assignment inside the Church. Emphatically not, for in this area the highest sentence is excommunication. One would expect all right-thinking men to go along with this. It is true the expression, "the perfection of Christ," is a bit strange, but it must be kept in mind that those who were gathered at Schlatten-am-Rond were pioneering and had to create a vocabulary. The terminology that comes at once to our minds was not yet current. The terms church and state were as yet undifferentiated. If for "the perfection of Christ" we substitute "the Church of Christ," as we may, then this delineation of the functions of the two entities is altogether acceptable. But not in the ears of a man of sacralist thought habits. Calvin not only thrust Schlatten-am-Rond to one side, but volunteered to refute it in print, saying, "The principal task of the magistrates is not the business of keeping their subjects in peace as to the body, rather is it to bring about that God is served and honored in their domains. For, quote, as the magistrates have the duty of purging the church of offenses by bodily punishments and coercions, so do the ministers have the duty of assisting the magistrates by reducing the number of those who offend." Calvin rebuked Schlatten-am-Rond, saying, quote, "The hand cannot say to the foot, I have no need of thee." Knowing full well that the authors of the manifesto had a way of going back to pre-Constantinian times, Calvin seeks to make them realize that they have no right to do so. For him, the Constantinian change was a big improvement on those earlier times. Those earlier days when the dignity of the Church still lay hidden, an idea which Calvin, as we shall see, owed to Augustine, that prime apologete for Christian sacralism. Here's a footnote. It says, in so applying the words of 1 Corinthians 12:21, Calvin reveals his sacralist attitude. For him, church and state are but two aspects of one and the same thing. He will not hear of any separation. And in this, Calvin was like all the rest of the reformers. One must agree with Karl Riker as he says, and then something in German, so that does not help us at all. Okay, and something in French. All right, moving on to the rest of the book. In fine, Calvin's reply to Schlatten-am-Rond was, "We ought not to shut out from among us the institution of civil justice, nor drive it out of the Church." In passing, the reader will note that at this point Calvin falls into the fallacy of which we spoke earlier, namely of thinking that, when the stepchildren clamored for the expulsion of the civil power from the Church, they were at the same time thinking that it be terminated in the civil area. Calvin's sacralist thinking made it impossible for him to distinguish between terminating the civil rule and expelling it from the affairs of the faith. From the monism that is reflected here, Calvin never escaped. In his way of thinking, what we now call the Church and what we now call the state are woven into a single fabric. Together they constitute a single entity. It was this monism that made it impossible for Calvin to understand what the stepchildren were driving at. It was this monism that found expression in the creeds that grew up under his influence. One can always learn where a man stands in regard to the tensions that came to expression between the reformers and the stepchildren if we ask him what he thinks of the Constantinian change as such. Exponents of Christian sacralism look upon the events of Constantine's day as the beginning of the Golden Age. Restitutionists look upon them as the end of the Golden Age. That Augustine was of the former category we have intimated, and we shall have occasion to feel his pulse again. That Calvin was of the same school has been shown, and will be shown in greater detail in later chapters of this volume. That Bogerman was of a similar mind we already know. The following passage from his hand will make the matter clearer still. The service of the magistrate in the matter of the care of religion began in the New Testament times with Constantine the Great. Seeing that the preceding rulers were heathen and hostile to the church, and that Constantine put forth proper zeal to procure for the church outward peace, and the true doctrine together with opposition for the teachings which he considered heretical. In passing, it may be of interest to know that such lavish praise for the man to whom the stepchildren referred as that dragon was too much for them. They shot back that Constantine had been an adulterer, to which Bogerman replied, "So was David, and a murderer moreover." This assessment of the Constantinian change was ingrained in the Reformed tradition. How they felt about it at the Synod of Dort may be gathered from the lavish praise bestowed upon the civil power, which had convened the Great Synod for, quote, walking in the footsteps of your illustrious forebears, Constantine, Theodosius, etc. Not only were the leaders of the Reform committed to Constantinianism, they also welcomed every invasion of the sword into the affairs of faith, provided, of course, that the magistrate supported the right religion. They constantly urged the magistrate to draw the blood of the opposition. When Edward VI came to the throne of England, Henry Bullinger, successor to Zwingli in the Swiss Reformation, jubilated. We are able to quote him in an ancient English translation. "Blessed be that bounteous Lord, which hath not suffered the princes, whom by his divine providence he hath made and ordained." Okay, this is in Old English, so I'm going to have to just kind of translate it as I go into modern English. "And ordained to be the supreme governors of his church, immediately under him, to err and be deceived any longer, but did most merciful open their eyes to look upon that comfortable Son of righteousness and light of the truth, who shall with all prudence shed the blade of them that did shed the innocent blood." In passing, be it noted that if this spirit had been allowed to continue unabated, if this theology had not eroded away, there would have been no end to the religious wars of extermination. We spoke of erosion. Erosion is a slow process, and remnants of the Constantinian heritage were carried to the shores of the New World. Some of the colonies on the Atlantic seaboard excluded by all ranters and Quakers and other notorious heretics. But there was also the leaven of the stepchildren brought to these shores. The citizens of Providence refused to go along with the illiberal policy, saying that freedom of conscience was their most prized possession. Thereupon the Massachusetts commissioners retorted that these sectaries tend to the very absolute cutting down and overturn of all civil government among you. But erosion is also persistent. The colossus of Constantinianism fell, and as far as the New World is concerned, great was the fall thereof. The First Amendment of the Federal Constitution, which provided that Congress shall make no law establishing religion nor prohibit the free exercise thereof, was the death sentence of Christian sacralism. This amendment is a Monroe Doctrine, in which the soil of the New World is closed to sacralist plantings from the Old World. No doubt the very experience of carving out a new civilization in the wilderness hastened the day of the demise of Constantinianism in the New World. At any rate, it lingered on much longer in Europe, where it has been said only lately that the end of the Constantinian age has come. Within very recent times, however, an exponent of the Reformation tradition in the Netherlands gave clear evidence that in his mind Constantinianism was still very right and proper. We find this evidenced in his assessment of the Constantinian change, wrote Dr. Abraham Kuyper. When the first contest eventuated in this that the emperor bowed to Jesus, then the kingship of Christ began to be triumphant in society. The kingship of Christ from this time on stood as a direction-giving power above the imperial power, which, in order to strengthen its influence, tried for an ever-increasingly close integration with the kingship of Jesus. When in the 4th century persecution ceased and the imperial power showed a readiness to accommodate itself to Jesus, then the basic victory became apparent. This principal victory continued on during the entire course of the long period known as the Middle Ages. Wherever there are remnants of Constantinianism, there one detects a sort of nostalgia for for these people were the good old times, the days of Christian sacralism. Wherever the Constantinian formula has been effectively repudiated, there this nostalgia does not occur. In its place, one finds a nostalgia for the world depicted in the New Testament. Among the so-called younger churches, where there is no Constantinian tradition, separation of church and state is taken for granted. It seems safe to conclude that if the cause of Christ still has a future, and we have his word for it that it has, it will be in the climate of the composite society. This is but to say that it will be in the kind of world for which the stepchildren agonized, an activity that earned them the hateful name of Neo-Donatists. So that's the end of the chapter, but there's one more footnote here. It says, a curious monism comes to expression here. Oh, so it's referring back up to where it was talking about monism. The confluence of church and state in the days of Constantine, which Kuyper celebrates as a great triumph, required the rule right that comes to expression in the state to coalesce with the rule right that comes to expression in the church. This monism, if allowed to go its way, will cause men to slide imperceptibly from the common grace of God, which has given us the state, to the special grace of God, which gives us the church. It will cause men to slide imperceptibly from the sonship that results from the creator-creature relationship to the sonship that results from the redeemer-redeemed relationship. This monism bites as a caustic into the distinction of general revelation and special revelation. It tends to erase the distinction between Volk and Volk-Gotts. It is not surprising that the stepchildren, who opposed this insidious monism consistently, were spitefully called dualists by those who continued to adhere to it. That's the end of chapter 1.